There's a long tradition of people talking about public theology having multiple audiences. Some of these audiences are audiences within the church. Some of these audiences are audiences within academia. Some of them are audiences within the wider body politic. And sometimes, for reasons slightly puzzling to me, people like Max Stackhouse want to create fourth or fifth or seventh publics, including a public of economists, which is an odd bedfellow with the others. But at any rate, the public that I'm going to focus on for the next couple of minutes is going to be the public of the academy. And in particular, I'm interested in the role of public theology within theological education. Part of this may be just me exorcising demons from my seminary years. Part of it may also be me trying to exorcise some of the demons that I think theology has inherited from my home discipline, which is philosophy. I did my best to gaze into the tea leaves and see what the future of public theology might look like. But all I saw was that my tea was cold and I needed to put the kettle back on to warm it. So instead, I'm going to pick a fight. It's a fight that I think needs to be taken up if public theology is going to end up occupying the kind of place within theological education in the future that I think it really deserves. So here's my interlocutor. The interlocutor is a conception of public theology that sees public theology as a kind of applied theology. You see this in a number of places, but you get it nicely articulated in a decent soundbite form in Harold Breitenberg's kind of nice survey of public theology from 2003. He says public theology starts with theology and moves to ethics. And what I want to resist is that characterization, that you could start with theology without already having started with ethics. So if you are already convinced of the truth of that claim, you can pull your phones out and surf the web or do something else to entertain yourself for the next couple of minutes, because I'm going to try and urge that we can't think meaningfully about theology without also thinking meaningfully about ethics. So here's the controversial bit. I'll suggest that we should think of theology as ethics, or at least think of ethics as being something that's at the heart of the theological enterprise. There are going to be 4 different short points that I want to make. One of these will be a developmental point. One is going to be an epistemological point. A third will be a historical point, and the last is going to be a doxological point. So let me start with, sorry, I'm going to stop pacing in front of you, Doug. So let me start with the developmental point. Let me begin, as all philosophers do, with a couple of definitions. So, by ethics, I'm going to be interested in the field that is concerned with engaging in evaluative judgment, that's concerned with reasoning systematically about evaluative matters, and that is concerned with the motives, emotions, thoughts, dispositions, and actions with which such reasoning is concerned. By theology, I'm going to designate the field that is concerned with making judgments about the divine and reasoning systematically about the divine. By reasoning systematically about the divine, I don't mean to give pride of place to systematic theology. By reasoning systematically, we can include narrative theology and biblical theology. This is all under the rubric of thinking systematically. Okay, so now to the developmental point. There's a wide range of really interesting research that has been done on the development of children and their ethical sensibilities. And in a number of studies, we see between ages of 12 and 18 months that children already have a well-established sense of the intentions and emotions of the people around them, and a concern for the intentions and emotions of people around them. In other studies that have focused on 18-month-olds, we found an orientation toward helpfulness among young children. So an experimental researcher drops something that's just out of their reach, and without invitation or instruction, the 18-month-olds wanders over and picks up said item and returns it to the researcher, showing an interest that's unsolicited in being helpful. We find in that same age range, from 18 months to 24 months, in other studies, that there's an interest in victims of poor treatment. So that if you have two researchers, one of whom is treating another one badly, then there's an inclination on the part of the 18-month to 24-month-old to show some kind of kindness to the victim of that exchange. Similarly, there's an inclination to show generosity to those whom they've seen helping others around them, and an inclination to withdraw or withhold goods and or retract goods from aggressors in these kinds of exchanges. So already at this really early age, we have a fairly well-developed orientation toward ethical space. Before we're capable of reasoning systematically about the divine, I want to suggest, based on these and other studies, we're already acting on a fairly well-developed sense of how people should be treated. Second step in the discussion looks at the nature of reasoning and the pursuit of reasoning. The opening thought is that we've got a norm that governs this space. The norm is use what you already understand to get a grip on what you don't. Some argue that this isn't just a normative claim, it's a descriptive claim. We can't ever but understand any new material unless we're already drawing upon resources that we already have a grasp on. But I'll leave that more contentious claim to one side. At the very least, the normative claim seems uncontroversial. That the most responsible way to expand the scope of our comprehension begins with that of which we're confident, and uses that to evaluate the meaning and plausibility of novel information. If that's an appropriate way to think about the norms of reasoning, well then, I want to suggest, based on the early stages at which we already have a fairly solid handle on thinking ethically, that it turns out our thinking about the divine and our reasoning about the divine will end up being subordinate to our reasoning about ethics. We already have a confident grasp on ethical space at an early age before we have the skill set to begin thinking about the divine, and that's going to shape how we encounter this novel information, new proposals that are made about divine agents. The third point is the historical point. There's historical precedent for thinking that ethics is core business for theology and is going to shape theology. Let's take the theology that we get from the redactor of Exodus. We see from beginning to end that Exodus is concerned with ethics through and through. It's also telling us various things about the nature of the divine, but the things that it tells us are also primarily ethical. We learn that God is faithful, that God is authoritative, and that God is deeply concerned with justice. Now, you might object to my choice of the example of Exodus. I'm hoping you'll already agree that as one begins to think theologically with the redactor of Exodus, you're already knee-deep in ethics, but you might resist this as kind of cherry-picking, an easy case. But I want to say we find the same thing if we choose any number of other texts from within the canon. Take Isaiah. The opening move in Isaiah, its first note is an ethical note. Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared up children and I brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. It's the final note that gets sounded in the book. And they shall go out and look at the dead bodies of the people who have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. From beginning to end, Isaiah engages us at an ethical level. We can't understand who God is, what God is doing, or why God might be doing until or unless we've already engaged with the ethical resources that we were gesturing at just a minute ago. So what the reader learns about God depends on that reader already having a well-developed set of ethical sensibilities. Or to move forward yet again, let's think about the Synoptic Gospels. You can't begin to climb the ladder of Christology without a leg up from ethical sensibilities. You can't understand who the gospel writers take Jesus to be, what Jesus is doing, why Jesus is doing it, or why we should care unless you already have the resources to understand the nature of brokenness, the importance of a better way of things, and the significance of a divine order, of God's will being done on earth as in heaven. Now to the last of the points, the doxological point. I want to say that if we think that the telos of theology is doxology, then we find that ethics is again at the heart of theology. So, if the divine is not good, then we have no grounds for love. If the divine is not just, we have no grounds for praise. And what we do not admire, we cannot worship. Already, in our thinking about the object of theology and its accomplishment of its purpose, we have to be engaging with ethical material. We're evaluating the nature of the agent with whom we're being presented, and our responses to that agent are responses that are dependent on our ethical sensibilities. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not wanting to claim that our ethical thinking is independent of our theological thinking, or that it's fully formed and completely formed independently of our theological thinking. The best version of the conversation would be a longer than 12-minute version of the conversation, and we'd discover that ethics was going to also benefit from having theology as a partner in the process. That our starting point, our opening sensibilities, shaped as they are by our cultural milieu, are things that are open to further questioning, to scrutiny, critical and positive alike, and that the theologian can be part of that conversation. So I'm not wanting to claim anything about the autonomy of ethics. I merely want to say you can't begin to do theology and think that what you're doing is somehow ethics-free, because ethics is there at the heart. The things where our convictions are strongest are areas where we have ethical commitment. So the implications of these 4 points, I think, are that ethical convictions are preceding and shaping our theological ones. They can subsequently then be shaped by theological thought, and the conversation can continue, but we start with well-grounded ethical convictions before we start forming any theological convictions. And if this is the case, then I want to suggest that public theology, rather than being an extension into an alien territory, is at the heart of the theological capital. It's already there in the center, because the ethics with which we find the canon most concerned isn't just the ethics of the individual. We find it's, the ethics of the community. Over and over and over again, our attention is drawn not just to what is the individual's good, but it's drawn to the common good. And if public theology's focal concern is going to be an engagement that's rooted in theology and oriented toward shaping our understanding and our pursuit of the common good, then public theology has to be there at the start. So contrary to the image that you find within my discipline, where we have metaphysicians standing up high, and ethicists, they're doing something that might not even count as philosophy, truth be told. They clearly inhabit a lower order within the telos of philosophical achievement. And I think there's a kind of inheritance of that often within theological discourse. Within my seminary institution, we had 3 semesters of systematic theology focused on understanding divine metaphysics and focused on, dogmatics. but without really any discussion of ethics. There was a course on ethics, a kind of afterthought that was a joke amongst the student body because it was seen by many within the faculty as a joke, and no requirement at all that we do anything in public theology. Public theology stood outside the gate within this space. I think that's not where it belongs. Its future, if theology is going to have a future, its future, if theology is going to be true to its fundamental calling, has to be right in the center of the curriculum, as the space in which our students begin and perhaps the space in which they end their theological reflection, not the space that comes as a footnote or an afterthought to theological shaping. Because otherwise, the future generation of theologians will be no wiser than the previous generation of theologians. And future public spaces will be no better as a result of